Unlike typical missing 411 cases, the disappearance of Gunnar Peterson would also feature a heartfelt recovery, with Gunnar appearing to have been in perfect health at the time of his recovery. His account for exactly what caused his disappearance is a matter even more difficult to explain, however, and is often remarked as one of the first true missing 411 cases dating as far back as the early 1950s. According to the Gunnar Peterson report, back on the 6th of August during the year 1950, Mr. Peterson had travelled to the Colville National Forest, located in the state of Washington only 2 miles south of the Canadian border, with his entire family, to engage in a nice relaxing weekend vacation of hiking up and down the Churchill Mountain. Once at the National Forest, it became apparent to the family that the native wild-grown huckleberries were in season and ripe for picking. This sudden realization led the family to planning their day around picking huckleberries together on the side of Churchill Mountain and spending the rest of the day having a picnic at the summit. Unfortunately for the Peterson family, as the group were picking huckleberries near the top of the mountain in open areas well within the line of sight of each other, the family suddenly noticed that the father and husband Gunnar Peterson was no longer within the sight of the family. Wondering where he'd gone off to, Gunnar's daughter Mrs. W.A. Graves had called out to her father several times, but got no response. At first the family was not worried about his temporary absence, believing that perhaps he had decided to use the restroom nearby, or ventured into a more secluded area where he'd no longer be within earshot of the group. As the day stretched on, however, the group grew increasingly worried, as every member continued searching and calling out to Gunnar, but getting no response. After seeing no sign of Gunnar for over 3 hours, the family would immediately call the local Stephen County Sheriff's Department and report 65-year-old Gunnar as missing. Within only a few hours of being alerted, Sheriff Beryl Warren would bring together several dozen search and rescue volunteers, made up of local residents, fellow law enforcement officers, the National Park Forest Service personnel, and several dozen soldiers from the local military base. The first night, the search and rescue volunteers focused on combing through the area where he'd last been seen with his family, following any trails and areas that connected with wild huckleberry bushes that the father could have ventured off into. Despite looking through every open huckleberry bush, they found no sign of Gunnar. After the first 2 days of searching, law enforcement and search and rescue volunteers were growing increasingly desperate, due to the sudden drop in temperatures in the area and the light rain. Given the fact that the mountain stands at a height of almost 4,800 feet in elevation, and is filled with layers of lush thick forest and hundreds of small running bodies of water, search and rescue teams were growing increasingly concerned with the possibility of finding Gunnar Peterson alive, as they believed that the terrain would have made it incredibly difficult for Mr. Peterson to have safely made his way down the mountain, while lost and alone. By the 3rd day of Gunnar Peterson's disappearance, a specialized canine search and rescue team was employed in the search that had come from Idaho and eastern Washington. After the family supplied the dogs with clothes and shoes that Gunnar Peterson had worn, the dogs followed the scent into the middle of a huckleberry bush path, where Mr. Peterson had been seen by his family. Oddly enough, the sheriff would remark that the canines seemed confused as to where the trail continued, and were unable to maintain Gunnar's scent for long before losing it entirely. After 7 days of looking for Mr. Peterson, search and rescue volunteers started to give up hope on finding Mr. Peterson alive, causing the search efforts to slowly taper off, as law enforcement, military personnel and forest servicemen had the primary goal of finding a body, and no longer a living person. The search for Mr. Peterson would continue for another 3 days, until Gunnar's daughter and her husband would find Gunnar more than 5 miles away. According to Gunnar Peterson's daughter, she and her husband continued searching for her father in a circling radius that would lead them 5 miles away from the base of Churchill Mountain. As they were in the area, they started to notice a collection of abandoned houses and shacks, seemingly constructed in the middle of nowhere. According to the locals of the region, the houses had been constructed many years ago and were at the centre of what was referred to as high strangeness, with many of the locals too scared or superstitious to venture into the areas. As they searched through the abandoned shacks, Gunnar's daughter would find Gunnar sleeping in one of the abandoned buildings, seemingly in perfect health. According to Gunnar Peterson, he had survived in the area for 10 days primarily by drinking rainwater and living off huckleberries as his main food source. Oddly enough, at the time of his recovery, Gunnar Peterson had only been aware of 8 days that had passed, and had no idea that he'd been missing for a little over 10 days since the search began. When search and rescue volunteers and investigators questioned Gunnar Peterson as to how he appeared to have disappeared from the region, it became obvious that something far more bizarre had happened. Gunnar Peterson claimed when talking to investigators that he'd been picking huckleberries with his family only a few feet from the group when he suddenly felt a large mass strike the back of his head. He would then wake up sometime during the middle of the night in pitch black darkness, believing that a falling limb or rock must have knocked him unconscious. Oddly enough, there were no marks or sign of damage against Mr. Peterson's head, and he'd been standing in an open field of bushes on the side of the highest point of the mountain, where any falling debris would have been difficult to explain. Even more bizarre, however, was that Mr. Peterson counted only 7 days having passed after he'd awoken from his unconscious state. This led him to believe that he must have been knocked unconscious for a period of over 2 days, as he was unable to account for 2 of the 10 days that had been missing, originally believing that he'd only been missing for 8 days. So what do you make of this mysterious disappearance? Be sure to leave your questions and answers in the comment section below, and help us to grow this community while working to solve these unexplained mysteries. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos.